Hi, I'm Kevin Kraft. This is PE 589, Physical Education and Exercise Science Capstone with Angela Robles, Fall 2, 2017. This is concussions in Japanese football. Brief introduction to the topic is concussions and head injuries in the sport of football have been a hot topic right now as they relate to long-term health. And in the game of Japan, in Japan, football in Japan, it's really played year-round, and so their exposure to contact is a lot higher, and I was interested in finding out more about the knowledge and understanding of and attitudes of the game in Japan as it results to head injuries. So the purpose of this study was to explore Japanese college football players' perceptions of concussions. A central research question this study examines are as follows. What are Japanese football players' knowledge about concussions? What are Japanese football players' perceptions about concussions? And what effect does a Japanese game and practice schedule have on concussions among Japanese football players? Looking at the substantial research in the field, the first substantial research has to do with the danger of cumulative head blows. In this research, researchers were looking at high school athletes over the course of 2 seasons, and they were using fMRI testing, which tests oxygen flow in your brain so you can see how your brain is working and what portions are functioning, unlike MRI testing, which tracks water movement, so you see more structure of the brain. So using fMRI testing, they were using sensors in helmets to test G-forces. They were using impact testing, which is a neurocognitive test so that you can see if someone has a concussion. And the results showed that those who suffered concussions only suffered an average of 656 blows, whereas those who had showed no signs of concussion but impairments averaged 1,090 blows. So with a year-round game, that number of impacts can be a lot higher, and those subconcussive blows, they add up where it causes the trauma because they saw the trauma within the brains of those who did not have concussions but suffered more blows. So the real danger is the accumulation of blows, the subconcussive blows, and how that might look on a long-term scale might result in chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. So the second substantial research on the topic is from Metz et al., and they were doing research on deceased former football players. So they had 202 deceased former football players who were suspected of having CTE, and they donated their brains, and these were athletes of high school, college, Canadian football, and NFL levels. And they looked at their brains, and the results showed that 110 out of 111 athletes had CTE in the NFL. And then there was a lower percentage as you went down to college, and a lower percentage in high school and the Canadian League. So your exposure to the game increases your chances of having CTE. A limitation of this study was that these people thought they had CTE before their brains were even examined. But this was a really popular study that came out this summer and was being reported on a lot. The third research that was really substantial in this field is the need for no contact periods. And Berzerian et al. Was looking at college football players during the course of 1 season. And again, they were using fMRI testing and impact testing. And they followed football players, and they also followed control group. And they were looking at their brains before and after the season, and then 6 months after the end of the season. And they were really interested in understanding what the white matter and what was happening with the white matter, and how the course of a normal football season might impact white matter in the brain. And they were able to see a substantial reduction in white matter in the brain after the football season had ended. And then 6 months after the season ended and they tested them again, there was still a substantial reduction in white matter in their brains. So it shows that you need more than 6 months to recover from a normal football season, a normal fall football season as in America. So as it relates to the game in Japan, a year-round schedule would have a lot more, one could deduce, would have a lot more damage on the brain, and you're not giving it that time to recover, increasing your exposure to subconcussive blows, which has to do with CTE and head trauma. So working forward into my own research, I developed a quantitative research design with pen and paper. And the reason I really wanted to pursue this was there's a language barrier between Japanese and English, and I could elicit more of their thoughts and feelings through multiple choice responses and maybe understand more of their true feelings where there's a cultural divide. And secondly, the large response rate. So going to these schools, I wanted to have as much response as I could from each university. So I went to 3 different universities, and I was interested in college football players who were active members of the football team, regardless if they were hurt or not. And the survey instrument that I developed was the Japanese College Football Concussion Survey, JCFCS. It was a 4-part questionnaire. The first portion was designed to attain demographic data. The second portion consisted of 8 true, false, or unsure questions to obtain their knowledge of concussions. The third section consisted of 6 Likert questions designed to elicit their perceptions of concussions. And the fourth section was 5 yes-no questions to understand their attitudes about the practice and game schedule as they relate to concussions. Results showed that they did not have adequate knowledge of concussions or symptoms. So going down the list, only 4% of athletes understood that you do not need to be knocked unconscious to diagnose a concussion. Only 4%. Only 30% of athletes understood that normal MRI or CT scans are associated with concussions. Only 55% knew that you could get a concussion from a direct blow or an indirect blow, like a whiplash effect, and only 55% got that right. Only 48% recognized emotional changes as an indication of concussion. Only 37% recognized sleep disturbances as an indication of concussions. And only 60% recognized that cognitive function at rest is not sufficient for return to play. You need more time than just being okay and understanding where you are to return to the field. And yet, 94% knew that attaining a second concussion might be catastrophic. So they did not have very adequate knowledge about concussions, how they could get a concussion, or the symptoms associated with those concussions. In their perceptions of concussions in the game, because these are Likert scale, I'm just going to give you the majority. So the majority thought that they had the ability to recognize a concussion. The majority of athletes thought that concussions were significant to health. The majority of athletes felt that they had the ability to self-report a concussion to a coach or a trainer. The majority of athletes felt that they could report a teammate who might show signs of a concussion. And the majority of athletes felt that they would be disappointing their teammates and coaches if they did not participate because they had a concussion. And the majority of athletes felt that they would play even if they had symptoms of concussions. And the majority of athletes felt that their teammates should not participate if they had signs of concussions. So this shows that they feel comfortable reporting when they have a concussion, but they don't have, they feel that they might be letting their teammates down if they don't participate. But if they do have the symptoms, they will participate anyway. So kind of some interesting findings there. And then finally, their attitudes on the schedule was really overwhelming. The overwhelming majority thought that concussions were a serious issue, 99.5%. 71% thought that football should not be played year-round, which they do. And 92.9% thought that there should be no contact periods during the year. And 82.2% thought that there should be a limited number of contact practices each week instead of every day going full contact. And only 57.4% thought that there was adequate concussion protocols. So really significant results in that section. As the discussion goes for those findings, only 4% identified a loss of consciousness is not required to diagnose a concussion. And previous research has shown that if you do not undergo concussion training, that majority of athletes will get this wrong. And only 16% identified MRI and CT scans are not associated with concussion. That's why in previous research, they have all these impact testing and neurocognitive testings. Unlike previous research, Japanese athletes are more likely to associate emotional changes than sleep disturbances. In Federer and Gunstad research, it was the opposite, but yet only 48% and 37% were able to identify these as signs of a concussion. In their perceptions, the majority felt like concussions were a serious topic. But in research in America, only 12% of athletes thought that concussions were serious on the short term, and only 10% accepted reality of maybe attaining CTE or dementia long term. So that was interesting. And then the participants strongly agreed that they felt comfortable reporting a concussion, but they don't necessarily know the signs of concussion as the knowledge indicated. In previous research in Bogatel 2014, as players got older, they were less likely to report, but in this research, it shows that the overwhelming majority felt like they could report a concussion and that they would report their teammates for having a concussion. Nearly half of the athletes thought that they would be disappointing their team if they did not participate. In Federer and Gunstad, this is a common reason for not reporting a concussion. So this was typical. And in previous studies, football players had an increased understanding of concussion symptoms, but were likely to believe that it was okay to play with such symptoms. But in the current research, it doesn't compare Japanese players to other sports, but it just shows how the athletes have an insufficient knowledge. They don't have more knowledge than anybody else. They don't really have sufficient knowledge in any way. And yet, if they feel like they had a concussion, which they might not know that they do, they feel like they would play anyway. So that was really interesting. And then finally, their attitudes on the scheduling was just overwhelming. I mean, really overwhelming that, the majority thought that there shouldn't be played. It shouldn't be played year round, and it shouldn't be played. There should be no contact periods. There should be no contact periods during the week. And so, as you've seen in the previous research, where it took more than 6 months to recover from the white matter, it's substantial. And 92% of athletes thought there should be no contact period. 71% think that there should be football should not be played year round, and the CTE and other long-term problems are a direct result of those statistics. And this study found that 82% of athletes thought that there should be a limited number of contact periods each week. Previous research has identified that 70% of total concussions in college football were due to fully padded practices, and 24% of total concussions in a previous research took place while athletes were wearing helmets and shoulder pads. So the less pads that you wear, the less contacts that you have, the less the chance that you're going to get a concussion. So the recommendations obviously are there needs to be more information. There needs to be more knowledge at the disposal of Japanese athletes. And they need to have that information so that they can understand what is a concussion, how can I report it. And then there needs to be a change in the schedule to reduce their likelihood of having long-term problems and really put the health of these athletes at the forefront instead of the development of them playing football. And the implications include athletic trainers. They can use the information in here to teach athletes more, tell them the symptoms, and get more of a response during practices. Coaches can use this as a foundation where athletes feel like they can tell their coaches. So they need to build on that foundation of player development and well-being so that players will still feel comfortable reporting to the coaches, because they're a really big important part of this. Athletes, obviously, they can look at this and say, hey, we need to learn more and understand more. And then finally, it's called JAFA in Japan, but the associations here, they can use this as a, it's a voice for the athletes to express, hey, we don't want to play year round. And I think that the current research is showing we need to have more, we need to be more in line with the current research on concussions and head injuries and how we can avoid any health implications of that. And so that means restricting practices, restricting contact periods, and it would be good for the game. It would be good for everybody. And finally, future research. There's so much future research to be had in Japan. You could systematically go down each of these topics and investigate what are players' knowledge. Just a systematic, what are the knowledge? What do they actually know? Or test them, give them more information on concussions, and then test them and their attitudes. Because in this research, I didn't give them what concussions were and then test their attitudes. So you could educate them what a concussion is, all the symptoms, and then test them again about what their attitudes are, and maybe their responses would be different. Maybe they wouldn't feel as comfortable reporting a concussion because they feel like they would be sitting out more or something like that. And also you could create a comprehensive study including sensors and some of the fMRI testing through the course of seasons to really get an understanding of what concussions are like on a year-round basis in Japan, or what the impacts are of a year-round schedule of football on a Japanese football player. There's so much to still explore in this topic in Japan. So that's the research, and looking forward to everybody's questions, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Great.